In 1990, through the United Nations, the world committed to cut in half the then 28% of humanity living in extreme poverty by the year 2015. It was thought by many an unrealistic goal, but the goal was actually met years before, and by 2016, for the first time in history, the portion of humanity living in extreme poverty was reduced to less than 10%. Now, the world has set a goal of abolishing absolute poverty by 2030. Can it be done? What policies and technologies are needed to make real this age-old dream? And what obstacles stand in the way? This episode of The Whole Truth was made possible by the Millspring Foundation, the Doran Family Foundation, Amatec, and by
For hundreds of years in English-speaking courtrooms around the world, people have sworn an oath to tell not only the truth, but rather the whole truth. The oath reflects the wisdom that failing to tell all of a story can be as effective as lying if your goal is to make the facts support your point of view. In the courtroom, the search for truth also relies on advocates advancing firm, contradictory arguments and doing so with decorum. All of these apply to the court of public opinion, what John Stuart Mill called the marketplace of ideas. This series is a place in which the competing voices on the most important issues of our time are challenged and set into meaningful context so that viewers like you can decide for themselves the whole truth. It's commonplace to note the extraordinary challenges and dangers of the 21st century world, from global warming to the spread of nuclear weapons. All of these are true problems, but aren't the whole truth of our time. On today's episode of this program, we hope to elucidate some of the reasons for hope about opportunities unique to the 21st century. It is an indisputable fact that the percentage of humanity living in absolute poverty, once the fate of essentially all of humankind, has now fallen to its lowest level ever, less than 10%. Across the world, there are newly thriving cities filled with many hundreds of millions of newly minted modern middle-class inhabitants. Of course, the gains of globalization are unevenly spread. Many are left behind, and there is reason to believe that in the long run, in the next 50 years or so, the magic of the market really could and perhaps will lift virtually all of humanity to something resembling the living conditions of contemporary middle-class Americans. But many millions might still live lives that are classically nasty, brutish, and short along this route of transition as we make our way to that better future. There are many dedicated individuals out there who are working on many relatively small ideas, but which taken together offer the real promise of ending absolute poverty before the long-term benefits of a global economy reach to the world's furthest quarters. Joining us today to discuss some of these innovative, disruptive, and hope-filled ideas are Dr. Charles Yarish, a globally renowned expert on seaweed and its uses, and professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at University of Connecticut. Dr. Cody Friesen, co-founder and CEO of Zero Mass Water. Ali Jaffer, global COO of Generation, and Dr. Sasha Kramer, co-founder and executive director of Sustainable Organic Integrated Livelihoods, SOIL, who is joining us via Skype from their headquarters in Haiti. Dr. Friesen, please tell our viewers about Zero Mass Water and more broadly about thinking on this question of water scarcity. We were talking beforehand, some of this, we're all aware of the fact that this planet might be drying out in some way, that we may have less access to fresh water. And some of these problems are man-made, perhaps global warming, perhaps we were talking before the show, the Colorado River, the way that has been dammed and planned. Tell us about your efforts in this area.
Thanks, David. So Zero Mass Water, we founded to fundamentally improve the human relationship to the water we consume. And when you look at the lower part of the atmosphere, the troposphere, there's more water vapor in that part of the atmosphere than all the fresh water on the planet. And so there's this opportunity to potentially efficiently, produce fresh drinking water, high quality drinking water for people anywhere on the planet. And so we set out to develop now a product that we refer to as SOURCE, which is a hydropanel, which is a name given to the product to recognize the fact that it is like a solar panel, but it does not make electricity. Instead, it takes sunlight and air and produces high-quality drinking water effectively anywhere. SOURCE is now in 10 countries on 5 continents, ranging from equatorial jungle-type conditions to extreme desert conditions. And so when you think about water scarcity and water stress going forward, it's important to look at the last handful of decades where water stress has become an ever greater problem for humanity. You don't have to look too far into the future. In fact, you can look into the past and see that at almost every level of economic station in almost every geography around the world, people have water stress, ranging from the American Southwest, as you indicate, where it's about water scarcity, to I've spent a lot of time in Indonesia where there's 3 meters of rainfall per year, and yet there's nothing to drink. And so how do we think about leapfrogging infrastructure, disintermediating a lot of broken infrastructure and challenges associated with pollution and climate change and many other things, resiliency, and a technology that is entirely infrastructure free means we can just show up. So when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, we sent panels there.
In effect, that water plenty is possible as well, at least technologically possible.
Absolutely, and I think to the broader point, what we know is that as people are lifted up economically, population goes down in those population growth goes down in those regions, right? And so I'm a big believer that in the conscious capitalism movement that was founded by John Mackey, the founder and CEO of Whole Foods, and this idea that capitalism is the greatest force that has ever been derived by humanity, even though it's not perfect, for lifting people up. And I'm also a big believer that innovation can solve grand problems, right? So when you talk about small things having big impacts, right? These small things, these things that disintermediate infrastructure, like what we're doing with SOURCE, where you can all of a sudden own a resource that is a fundamental human right that historically you had this big supply chain and infrastructure need between you and that resource. So to the extent that we are doing that and others are thinking along those lines, where we are lifting people up with those technologies, we are also intrinsically bringing those people up with education, with all these other things that they need. In addition, the flow of capital into the emerging markets and the developing regions of the world absolutely is one of the biggest constraints. And so some of that is because of local government that's constraining it. But I think broadly, when you look at the multilaterals, the development banks, which do great work, expanding their roles, I think will actually really advance the acceleration of technologies into many of these places. Because the solutions exist, but obviously there are all sorts of challenges associated with credit and all sorts of other issues at the individual level and, of course, at commercial and governmental levels. And so when you start bringing multilateral money on top of private industry, we bring development bank money on top of private industry to provide concessional financing, project financing to some of these new technologies, that's when you can really accelerate any number of these technologies to the field.
On this episode of The Whole Truth, we've heard from just a few of the many technologists, entrepreneurs, social activists, and thinkers, often working in isolation from one another, who collectively are forging paths toward the possibility of a world without absolute poverty. Can humanity create a world that can adequately feed the population of 10 billion predicted for the middle of the century? Can we provide clean water and sanitation for every one of those 10 billion souls? Can we deal with widespread drought and other climate and geological threats? And in a world of robots and artificial intelligence, a world in which some nations have an unprecedented percentage of senior citizens, while others have a majority of their populations in their teenage years and younger, Will there be work for everyone, and will the skills available match the work which still needs to be done by humans? These are among the great questions of the 21st century, and the whole truth of the meaning of this century will be found in how humanity comes together to answer them. I am David Eisenhower. Thank you for watching.
This episode of The Whole Truth was made possible by the Millspring Foundation, the Doran Family Foundation, Amatec, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.